That don't mean a damn to me. My wife is gone and she won't be back.
25 members of Mary Bound's family came to Parchman for the execution. Her daughter, Gina Watson, was going to be a witness.
Please don't forget the victims. And may we gain a heart of wisdom from my mother's death.
She left church with a hymnal in her hand. 48 hours later, they found her in the woods, face battered beyond recognition, blood soaked into the dirt, her body left like it meant nothing. No one saw it happen. There were no screams, no witnesses, and no clear reason why. Mary Ella Bounds was 56 years old, a choir member, a grandmother, a woman whose entire life was rooted in faith, family, and routine. So when the news hit her Mississippi town, it didn't just cause grief, it caused fear, because whoever did this had no clear motive. And what came next only made it worse. The man arrested days later had a long criminal record and the IQ of a child. He confessed in vivid detail, but for 21 years he insisted he shouldn't die for it. Some called it justice delayed. Others called it a legal failure that went too far. But the part no one expected was the mother of the killer, who refused to let go of her son and buried him beside the husband who prayed he'd never live to see it happen. This case isn't just about murder. It's about the kind of justice that haunts you long after the sentence is carried out. Mary Ella Bounds didn't need attention to feel important. She didn't speak loudly, didn't dress to be noticed, and didn't travel far from home. She simply moved through the world with the kind of presence that people quietly respected. She was 56, a grandmother, a Sunday school teacher, and every Sunday evening without fail, she showed up for choir practice at First Baptist Church in Houston, Mississippi, just a few blocks from her home. Mary had lived her entire life in this region. Born in Sunflower County to Ella Dill Springer and the late Martin Theo Springer III, she was the second of 4 siblings. Those who knew her described her voice as soft and low, but steady, especially when she sang. In a town where reputations could outlive a person, Mary's name had only ever been associated with decency, faith, and service. She worked at Seminole Industries, a quiet job that didn't bring much attention, but it helped keep her independent. She didn't ask for help unless she truly needed it. That's just who she was. At church, she taught children's classes on Sundays, sang soprano in the choir, and sometimes helped clean up the sanctuary after events. She wasn't the type to rush out after service. She lingered. She asked how people were doing. She noticed when someone hadn't been there. Mary had 1 daughter, Gina, and 3 grandchildren, all of whom she adored. Her husband, Charles Bounds, was a respected figure in the town, quiet like her but always present. Together, they were one of those couples everyone knew without knowing much about. They didn't make noise, but they never missed a thing. She didn't trust strangers easily, she didn't leave town much, and she rarely did anything alone that wasn't church-related. Which is why, on Sunday night, November 29th, 1987, when she didn't come home after choir practice, everyone who knew her knew something was wrong. Mary Bounds didn't go missing. She wasn't careless. She wasn't reckless. And she didn't have secrets. She had a routine, a life built on quiet things. And now, suddenly, she had vanished into the night. Monday morning came and went, so did Tuesday. Mary Ella Bounds had not shown up at work. She hadn't returned home. She hadn't called anyone. And by then, her daughter Gina had already checked with the church, the hospital, and the sheriff's office, hoping for a misunderstanding. But in a town like Houston, Mississippi, silence from someone like Mary wasn't a delay. It was a warning. By Tuesday afternoon, the search had widened. Family, church members, and neighbors fanned out along the roads, checking ditches and driveways. Some prayed, others feared the worst. Her husband, Charles, stood mostly silent, pacing the front porch of their home with reddened eyes, offering no false hope. Then, late that afternoon, a deputy found something just off County Road 416. It was Mary's car. The vehicle had been left on the edge of a wooded patch, the doors shut, the windows rolled up. There was no sign of damage, no forced entry, no broken glass. But what stopped them cold was the blood. It was smeared along the outside of the driver's door, with droplets trailing faintly toward the gravel. The handle was streaked with it. Inside the vehicle, the front seat had a faint stain in the fabric, like something or someone had briefly rested there while bleeding. Whatever happened, it hadn't happened far away. Authorities sealed off the area, and a larger sweep of the woods began. It didn't take long. Just a few hundred yards from where the car was found, a deputy called out. There, beneath a shallow brush of pine needles and broken twigs, lay the body of Mary Ella Bounds. She was fully clothed, her shoes still on. Her purse was missing, but her hands, one of them, still clutched a folded church bulletin. Her face had been beaten beyond recognition. The bruising was deep. Her skull had suffered multiple blunt force injuries, deliberate, forceful, and sustained. She had not been shot. She had not been stabbed. She had been beaten to death with someone's bare hands. There were no defensive wounds on her arms, no signs of a struggle, no indications that she had tried to run, only the injuries to her head and the stillness of her body. The medical examiner would later confirm the cause of death as multiple blunt force trauma to the skull. Time of death: likely Sunday night, within hours of her choir practice. The news spread fast, faster than law enforcement could contain it. Houston was not the kind of town where people locked their doors during daylight. It was a place where folks still waved at passing cars and left their keys in the ignition during Sunday service. That all changed within 24 hours. No one could make sense of it. Why Mary? Why like this? There had been no ransom note, no robbery, no reported enemies. It wasn't an accident, but it wasn't clear what it was either. It felt wrong, unnatural, not just for the town, but for the kind of person she was. For the first time in decades, the people of Houston weren't just mourning a loss. They were asking a question they weren't used to asking. Who did this, and why? Long before his name ever appeared in a police report, Earl Wesley Berry was already known to the town of Houston, but not in the way Mary Bounds was. He was the kind of man people remembered for the wrong reasons. Born in 1959, Earl was one of several boys raised in the rural stillness of northeast Mississippi. He didn't speak until he was nearly 5 years old, and even when he did, the words came out tangled, hard to understand. His brothers often had to translate for him. In school, he struggled. Reading, writing, comprehension, nothing came easy. Teachers marked him down as slow. He dropped out before he ever had a chance to finish. By the time Earl was 20, his name had already passed through the county court system more than once. Simple assault, grand larceny, perjury, burglaries, 2 escape attempts. He was no stranger to handcuffs or to hospital beds. There was an accident once. He was swimming, dived headfirst into a shallow hole, and slammed his skull against the rock beneath the surface. Something changed after that. He became more erratic, more withdrawn. Medical professionals later said that trauma may have worsened whatever mental issues he already had. Eventually, doctors labeled it paranoid schizophrenia. His prison records would later read suicidal gestures, mentally retarded. His IQ was tested and measured in the low 70s, sometimes even lower, depending on who did the testing. His own mother, Velma Berry, would later call him bipolar and slow-minded. But no label could explain his moods. He could go days without speaking, then explode into laughter over something no one else understood. He made people uncomfortable, but not because he was aggressive, mostly because he was unpredictable, and that kind of unpredictability felt dangerous when you didn't know where the edges were. At home, he was in and out. Sometimes he stayed with his parents. Other times, he lived at his grandmother's house a few miles outside town, off a gravel road thick with pine trees and silence. He loved the outdoors, hunting, fishing, swimming. He didn't like crowds, didn't like being told what to do, and didn't have close friends. As a teenager, he started drinking, then drugs. By the mid-1980s, he was spiraling. In 1985, after another run-in with the law, Barry was given a choice: rehab or jail. He chose rehab. His mother thought maybe, just maybe, that would be the turning point. But it wasn't. 2 years later, by the fall of 1987, he was living with his grandmother again. He had no steady job, no real direction. Just a body built from lifting weights in the backyard. And a mind that had grown quieter and darker with each passing year. What kept him afloat were small routines: drives into town, short visits to his parents' place, long hours spent alone. To most, he was just another troubled man drifting along the back roads of Chickasaw County, barely noticed, barely understood. He was 6'1", strong, reclusive, diagnosed, ignored, and left mostly to himself. There were no outbursts, no threats. No one saw anything coming. And so, when the townspeople whispered about Mary Bounds, when the church pews filled with fear, when the deputies asked if anyone knew someone capable of such a thing, very few thought of Earl Barry. But in the quiet, isolated life he lived, something had already been unraveling for years. It was a Sunday evening like any other. The choir at First Baptist Church had wrapped up practice not long after dark. Mary Ella Bounds, dressed in her modest church clothes, carried her hymnal as she walked toward her car in the parking lot. She never saw him coming. According to what he would later confess, Earl Wesley Barry had been driving his grandmother's vehicle that night, a quiet cruise through the streets of Houston, Mississippi. He spotted Mary outside the church, alone. In that moment, something inside him shifted. He pulled the car over, parked, watched. Then he stepped out, walked across the lot, and struck her. With one sudden blow, he knocked her off balance, then forced her into the passenger seat of his grandmother's car. There were no screams, no sounds loud enough to draw attention, just silence, and the engine turning over as he drove her out of town. What came next was chaos disguised as control. Barry drove to a wooded area just outside Houston. In his confession, he said he initially intended to rape her. When he parked, he forced Mary from the vehicle, lifted her over a fence, and ordered her to lie down on the ground. But he didn't go through with it. Instead, he changed his mind, told her he was taking her back to town. He didn't. Instead, he drove to another remote wooded area, deeper into Chickasaw County, more isolated than the first. Again, he pulled over. Again, he forced her from the car. This time, Mary begged. She pleaded for her life, for mercy, for someone, anyone, to help. But no help came. Barry used his fists and forearm to beat her to death, striking her head repeatedly until her body went limp. There was no weapon, just brute force, unrelenting and precise. When it was over, he lifted her over a second fence, carried her deeper into the trees, and left her there, face down among the pine needles, her blood soaking into the earth. He got back in the car, drove away. Along the road, Barry discarded his shoes, 2 mismatched tennis shoes, now stained with Mary's blood. When he arrived at his grandmother's house, he burned the clothes he had worn. The towel he used to wipe blood from the car door, he tossed that into a nearby pond behind the property. He never said what he was thinking as he did all this, whether he felt panic or shame or nothing at all. But someone was watching. His brother James had been at the house. He saw Barry frantically wiping the car down, trying to clean something off the passenger side. He noticed the urgency, the way Earl moved, the clothes he threw out, the shoes he no longer had on. James said nothing at first, but the silence wouldn't last. Mary's body hadn't been found yet. Her car was still out there. Her name had just started circulating among worried family and churchgoers. And Earl Berry? He went to sleep that night in his grandmother's house, as if nothing had happened. 3 days after the murder, Mary Bounds' car was found sitting just outside town. The doors were closed, the windows were clean, but blood stained the driver's side door, a faint smear like someone had tried to wipe it away but hadn't finished the job. Inside, investigators saw more. A few small stains on the passenger seat and faint fabric impressions near the floorboard. No signs of robbery, no sign of her purse. By then, her body had already been recovered from the woods, left beneath the trees with her church bulletin still in hand. The community's grief turned to unease, then suspicion. And quietly, behind closed doors, someone in that community had seen enough. That person was James Berry. He hadn't gone to the police immediately, not after seeing his brother Earl frantically wiping down their grandmother's car on the night of the 29th. Not after watching him burn a set of clothes behind the house. But something in him shifted after the body was found. It wasn't guilt. It was something closer to duty. The kind of line you know can't be uncrossed once blood is involved. On December 5th, 1987, James Berry picked up the phone and called the authorities. He told them everything. That night, deputies showed up at Earl Berry's grandmother's house. It was the same house he'd returned to after the murder. The same house where the car was parked, cleaned, and casually used again in the days that followed. Berry didn't run. He didn't ask questions. When they approached, he opened the door. They placed him under arrest and walked him to the squad car. That's when the call came in to Velma Berry, his mother. She rushed over, heart pounding, unsure of what she'd find. When she arrived, Earl was already seated in the back of the police cruiser. He looked out at her with a blank stare and said just one sentence. "Mama, they accusing me of killing that woman." Back at the station, investigators began pressing him for answers. Earl didn't fight it. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He just talked. He confessed to the entire sequence. How he'd seen Mary that night outside the church. How he struck her and forced her into the car. How he took her to one wooded area, then another. How he beat her until she stopped moving, then carried her deeper into the trees and left her behind. He even told them where to find the evidence: the mismatched tennis shoes tossed along the roadside, the towel he used to clean the blood now submerged in a pond behind the property. His knuckles were still scraped, skin torn from the force of the beating. The shoes were found. So was the towel, both soaked in dried blood. Everything he said lined up. There were no signs of remorse, no signs of panic. Just a cold, clinical retelling of what he'd done, as if he were reading it from a page someone else had written. Investigators processed the car, the home, the surrounding area, and with the confession, the physical evidence, and the eyewitness report from his brother, there was no doubt left. By nightfall, the booking photo had been taken. Earl Wesley Berry, 28 years old, habitual offender, diagnosed schizophrenic, now stood charged with the kidnapping and capital murder of Mary Ella Bounds. The silence that followed his arrest wasn't relief. It was something far more unsettling, realizing how close he had been the entire time. By the time the courtroom doors opened in early 1988, the state of Mississippi had already made its position clear. They were going to ask for death. Earl Wesley Berry was indicted on 2 charges, kidnapping and capital murder. But this wasn't a standard murder trial. Because Mary Bounds had been forcibly taken, the case qualified for capital punishment under a certain Mississippi code. And Berry's past made it even easier. He wasn't just a murderer, he was a habitual criminal. The jury heard everything. They saw the crime scene photographs. They heard the audio from Berry's confession. His cold voice describing how he beat Mary with his fists, how he dumped her body in the woods. They listened as the coroner described the injuries to her skull. And they watched as the man himself sat motionless at the defense table, saying nothing. The defense tried to argue mental illness. They pointed to his low IQ scores, his long psychiatric record. But there was no formal insanity plea, no psychological expert who could undo the weight of the confession. In closing arguments, the prosecutor didn't just speak to the jury, he spoke to the town. He reminded them that Mary Bounds was a grandmother, a churchwoman, a choir member who never harmed a soul. And he reminded them that the state of Mississippi had not only the legal right, but the biblical authority to end the life of the man who took hers. The death penalty, he said, has been authorized by Mississippi, and it's been authorized by scriptural law for a long time. The jury returned a guilty verdict. And when it came time to decide between life and death, they chose death. On October 28, 1988, Earl Wesley Berry was sentenced to die by lethal injection. He was transferred to death row at Parchman alongside 64 other condemned men and placed in a 6x9 cell to await his execution. But the case wasn't over. In 1990, the Mississippi Supreme Court upheld the conviction, but threw out the death sentence. The reason? The jury instructions had failed to properly define the aggravating circumstances required for capital punishment. Specifically, the term especially heinous, atrocious, or cruel hadn't been narrowly applied, leaving too much room for interpretation. Berry's sentence was vacated, but the state wasn't letting go. In 1992, a new sentencing trial was ordered, this time held in Union County due to the overwhelming publicity back in Chickasaw. It took just 3 days. The same evidence, the same argument, the same man. Once again, the jury returned a sentence of death. This time, it stuck. Berry was sent back to death row, where the clock would begin again. And for Mary's family, justice now had a date, even if no one knew exactly when it would come. Long before the state of Mississippi prepared the needle, Velma Berry had already begun her vigil. She was a small woman who lived in a brick house off the Manatee exit, 7 miles from the nearest trace of city life. She had buried her husband 64 days before the execution. Lung cancer took him slow, and before he passed, he told her the one thing he couldn't bear was seeing their son put to death. "I hope I'm gone when it happens," he told her from the recliner. He got his wish. And now Velma was alone. Alone with a photo album she couldn't close, a marker she couldn't afford for her son's grave, and a belief she refused to let go of. That Earl didn't do it. He wouldn't even kill a toad frog, she told reporters once, flipping through pictures of her boys. Her voice cracked every time she said his name. Earl was slow, she said, confused, manipulated, but not evil. She blamed his lawyers first. According to Velma, the public defenders who handled Earl's first trial never objected to anything. They didn't push back when the judge allowed damaging evidence. They didn't request a timely hearing on his intellectual disability. They just sat there, and the cost of their silence was her son's life. "If he'd had a fair trial," she said, "it wouldn't hurt me so bad." But he didn't. What hurt the most, though, was the way the world treated him after. 21 years on death row, locked in a concrete box, hearing the clang of metal doors and the voices of guards who never called him by name. Just Berry, just inmate, just a number waiting to be crossed off. She visited him when she could, some years more than others. He'd make jokes with her grandson, ask about old neighbors, pretend like he wasn't staring down a date he could never see. He tried to kill himself more than once. Velma knew that, swallowing razors, tying sheets. He didn't want to die by execution. He just didn't want to live in that cage. Velma wasn't naive. She knew what the court said. She knew what the state believed. But belief is different from love, and love doesn't always follow logic. So she fought, not in loud protests or legal filings, but in quiet ways. She brought him food during visits. She sat through hours of silence just to see his face. And when the day finally came, when she knew they were going to kill him, She gave him the only thing she had left, a promise. "Bring me home," he told her in one of their last conversations. "Bury me next to Daddy." And she did, even though she didn't know how she'd pay for it, even though his grave had no stone, even though it broke her to leave that cemetery with no one left at home. She kept her word, because sometimes the only justice a mother can give is to not let her son die forgotten. The death sentence was carried out. Earl Wesley Berry was buried beside his father, and Mary Ella Bounds was laid to rest days after the choir stopped singing. But even after the prisons cleared out and the headlines disappeared, grief remained. At First Baptist Church, her seat in the choir loft stayed empty. For months, no one touched it. The older members said they could still hear her voice faintly on Sundays, soft, steady, almost like she never left. Her granddaughter asked about her once during service. Someone told her, "She's with the angels now." Charles Bounds never spoke much about his wife's death, but those close to him said it aged him quickly. He didn't smile as easily, didn't stay long after service. And the day Berry was executed, he stood outside the prison and told reporters only this: "It took too long. I've had this on my mind for 20 years. It takes a lot out of you." Her daughter, Gina, chose different words. She said her mother would have wanted forgiveness, but even forgiveness leaves behind a scar. On the other side of that pain sat Velma Berry. She never attended the execution. She stayed home, in the same recliner her husband died in, with the curtains drawn and a Bible in her lap. She told herself it was over, that her son couldn't hear the bars anymore, couldn't hear the guards yelling, couldn't hear the silence that filled every hour of every day for 21 years. But closure didn't come easy. She couldn't afford a headstone for her husband or her son. She tried to get the military to cover her husband's. For Earl, she had nothing left to give. His brother James, the same one who turned him in, etched a message into a foot-tall stone by hand. It read, "Earl Wesley Berry, May 5th, 1959 to May 21st, 2008. Love, James." That's all that marked the grave. No trial transcript, no news clipping, just a jagged stone behind a salmon-colored country church, under the shade of 2 mammoth trees. What remains of Mary's life is honored. What remains of Earl's is hidden. And what remains for the people who loved them both is silence. No one really won. The courts handed down a sentence. The state carried it out. But the people left behind? They still wake up every day with the same absence. They still drive past the church, or the prison, or the cemetery, carrying memories that won't quite stay buried. This wasn't just a murder. It was a slow unraveling of 2 lives, one lost to violence, the other to silence. If this story stayed with you, if you felt the weight of Mary Bounds and the grief of Velma Berry, then subscribe to Detective Bob. Because the past doesn't disappear. It waits to be understood, and we're here to tell it, one case at a time.